Dialogue Conspiracy Program. Hello there, everybody.
We made
Can I
it.
steal something from Abe Melenkoff?
Yeah, go
It's
ahead and read
entitled The Morning Report. Morning Report, colon. A lot of the joy of the election was squeezed away by the experts. It was a nifty double development. This is how it worked. The pollsters told us how we were going to vote long before Election Day, and the TV networks told us how we voted before the ballots were counted. Together, this adds up to making the voter himself obsolete, and minor legal steps should be taken at once to eliminate elections. Polls would be taken every 4 years, and the winning candidate would be photographed thanking a room full of humming computers. The loser could repeat after the event what he always says before: the polls are wrong. But the polls and the networks are right. Instead of spending millions on spot announcements, campaign managers would serve their candidates better by just switching the circuits on key computers.
Well, how about that? The election's over, and we made it. We've survived a couple of days, almost a week.
Almost a week.
Almost a week. It took
Well, I wouldn't say almost a week. Not quite a week. It's just been a few days, really.
I really dreaded the 1972 elections. For a whole year, I felt like I was working against time, that they should be stopped and should not proceed. And then when the Watergate thing broke, I was convinced that people would see this second government and the espionage trickery that had been played on the electorate and speak up and proclaim that they had been taken advantage of, the Democratic Party. But nothing happened.
Well, they didn't do it, did they?
No, nobody seemed to get that outraged. The Democrats don't seem to care that much about the espionage that's taken place to their party. The party's completely broken in shambles, and they sort of look to themselves to what's wrong. They don't look at the outside, that it could have been destroyed from the outside.
But we do have a trial starting. Do you think that's going to mean anything? The Watergate trial is due to begin next week, is it not?
Well, I don't think Nixon's going to have as much fun the next 4 years as he had before, because a lot of the secrets of the way he operates and manipulates are exposed. But the trials could turn out to be absolutely nothing, because 7 men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel, and 7 were found there and 7 were arrested. And the men that received the information that they were taking when they were bugging are not arrested. The men that paid them to do the job are not arrested. So it's just going to be a very limited trial unless they bring in more people anyway. They're not naming the persons that they were doing it for, just the people that were caught. So
you don't think there's much to look forward to in the trial?
Well, Richard Nixon controls the Justice Department so totally and the investigative agencies, and he's building up Patrick Gray to be the new head of the FBI, and with the image that he allows mustaches and colored shirts and no wiretapping, on congressmen. You don't need it now. The government is tightly controlled. You don't have to follow these people. They're not even speaking up. There's nothing to listen to anymore. He has the situation well in hand, from what I can see. When it was over, I almost thought that everyone deserved Richard Nixon. The people that could have done more didn't do it to get him out, where they really cared, like on some of these initiatives. And like the farm labor of the coast, they could swing that difference in the votes. And if they really didn't want Nixon, they could have done more. And if they wanted him, they got him. So either way, I'm accepting it, just without getting too excited or angry, because the frustration of not being exposed to the way the Republican Party has acted for the last 20 years would have been terrible, because the evidence of the conspiracies, the manipulation, has been available to various researchers. But when it was open to the public and people couldn't pick it up, then I began to think, well, maybe Richard Nixon's what they really want.
You think the whole concept of there being a grand master scheme that's quote-unquote bigger than all of us is just too much for the average American to handle?
Oh, yes. James Reston had an article in the New York Times this week that went into all the newspapers around the country. It was in the San Jose Mercury and the San Francisco Chronicle and the Monterey Herald. And he refers to the election as a writer's dream. And he goes into the drama of this particular election, and that he thinks maybe it was done so William White could write another book on the making of the president. But in this article that he had, he said no sensible book publisher would have risked much money a couple of years ago on a political novel so fantastic. He goes in with the death and the tragedy at the Bridge of Chappaquiddick and Edward Kennedy, the main hope of the Democratic Party and the logical successor, being unable to run this year. And he talks about the two murdered brothers. And then he goes to the tragedy of George Wallace, who was taken out of the race just when he was beginning to make progress in the North and hold the balance of power between the two major parties. And he goes into the Eagleton affair, which this week there was some suggestion that the FBI knew all along of Mr. Eagleton's problems, and that a Republican had informed Jack Anderson about the drinking thing, and it seemed like a trap that caught McGovern right off the bat. It goes into the hanky-panky of the Republican money. He calls it hanky-panky, this dangerous espionage, with the Republican dollars and the grain milk deals, the burglary. And then he says Martha Mitchell was attacked and drugged by our own security agents and forced her husband, the head of the committee to re-elect the president, to retire. And James Reston says the only possible explanation of all this, it must have been arranged by Teddy White as material for another novel, a scenario for a reasonable presidential campaign. It makes no sense at all. And then James Reston went on to say that in 1962, when Richard Nixon lost the race for governor in California to Pat Brown, he sat at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Suite 724 with Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Finch, Klein, Ziegler, and he said those are the people that are with him now in the White House. And at that time they were complaining about the press and the Democrats, and again this year they are. And at the beginning of his career with the Checkers speech and his secret campaign fund, he proclaimed his innocence. And now he has this huge campaign fund, and one of his daughters is married to Eisenhower's grandson. And James Reston passes all this off as just a story that is a novelist's dream. And I think that if you take everything he's saying and hold it side by side to the article I did in The Realist in my 9 years research, I don't take any of these things as being coincidental and unrelated. And I think, I've said over again, they all had to do with getting Richard Nixon into power, and it was a brilliant play. And the proof of what I'm saying could be laid out in front of people by just opening the National Archives, for example. And we talked about that last week. A new suit came up to open the National Archives to get the evidence on certain matters, John Kennedy's autopsy and his clothing and different items that Earl Warren, who was Chief Justice, said we can't have for 75 years. There's all kinds of evidence that would prove that these events were planned and not unrelated.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned a moment ago George Wallace and the shooting incident which took him out of the campaign. The observation was made during the election that the votes that Richard Nixon had, the percentages that Nixon had during this 72 election, resembled the vote that he had in 1968 plus Wallace's votes.
Yes.
Now, you indicate that you agree with that, and then the question is then, would that, do you think, support your theory that Richard Nixon had something to do with the Wallace?
Well, I feel very
incident?
Strongly that the evidence lines up that he certainly did have, and I'd be like to proven wrong.
But you do find something significant in the figures, the Wallace plus Nixon figures from 68 equaling roughly the. Did you find that to be true?
Well, I felt that Nixon needed those Wallace votes in Maryland. To take all the southern states, he needed the Wallace votes so it wouldn't be split. And that cinched his getting a lot of areas, Maryland and Michigan and the South. And with Wallace out of the race, Nixon was sure of a victory. He wasn't sure as long as there were other candidates in. He heavily financed the McGovern thing to get him in because he knew that he was the candidate easiest to beat. He needed the Southern votes. There was a story in the Washington Post. They're running a series of biographies of men involved in the Watergate affair in the White House. And there was one on Fred LaRue. And this is a very interesting story about Fred LaRue and his relationship to Richard Nixon. He's a man that works in the White House and until he went over to the committee to reelect Richard Nixon, that is on no White House books, receives no salary, and his background is very interesting. And it has to do with Wallace, too, because Fred LaRue is the man who is the architect or works as the Southern strategy man and plan how to get the Wallace votes to Richard Nixon without the North knowing that he was doing it.
And what was his plan?
Well, his plan was to work with the Wallace people, but to keep them, to get them to sign over to Richard Nixon, but not to let the North know that they were taking these votes away. They wanted Nixon to look liberal in the North, but they wanted him to look strong in the South. The Washington Post says that LaRue helped woo Wallace votes to Nixon in 1968 and then was keeping the Southern strategy alive and kicking. He meddled in the campaigns of Senator Eastland, and his father was a good friend of Eastland's. He's an oil millionaire, this Fred LaRue. Fred LaRue was mentioned by Baldwin at the time. He turned informer. He was the man who received the information from the Watergate across at the Howard Johnson Hotel. And he spoke up and told how he was assigned. Baldwin said LaRue took Martha Mitchell on sensitive trips and that he had a weapon that he handed Baldwin to use that was not registered, but he said, just say, this is my weapon, and you work for John Mitchell and the committee to reelect Richard Nixon. Well, LaRue is very important in the White House, and he's very high up in the category. He's John Mitchell's right-hand man, and when Mitchell isn't around, LaRue speaks for him. But he has no post in the White House, and he's not registered. And when he was mentioned in terms with the Watergate espionage, the men working at the White House, a lot of them didn't know who he was even. There's no pictures of him, and all his biography says was rank, serial number, and so forth, nothing about him. But the Washington Post did an interesting story on him. He's a very wealthy oil man from Mississippi, close friend of Eastland's, an intimate friend of his, got a degree in geology in 1951, and he has friends. He finances campaigns on both sides, Republican or Democrats, with any legislation on oil or gas, because they have a lot of gas and oil in Mississippi. His investments, they can control those decisions. LaRue owned a casino in Las Vegas, and before in 1963 he bought a small hotel and a casino in Las Vegas, which he sold in 64. Now, that was the period where Jack Ruby was going back and forth to Vegas, too, in 63. And there was a story about him done in Long Island Newsday where Fred LaRue's name never appeared on the lease. He bought a hotel called the Castaway, but his name wasn't there again. He's a very mysterious man who people didn't know at all, although he held a very important position in the White House. Another thing about LaRue was that he has a very close-knit family. Mother and sisters, they live on a compound with a tennis court and many homes around it, $100,000 each. But
well, there's nothing illegal about that.
No, there was nothing illegal. It was a widowed mother, but the question, his father died in a hunting accident in which LaRue had killed his father in 1957. This is John Mitchell's right-hand man in the White House, and they didn't know. There was a lot of mystery involved. The mother and the brother and sister and Fred live very tightly, close together, don't see anybody, and the sister Ruth says she doesn't know the details of the accident. She said it was one of those unavoidable things. Fred killed his father accidentally in 1957, and he's riding planes with Martha Mitchell and handing a weapon that isn't registered to Mr. Alfred Baldwin. He's had enough experiences with weapons, I should think. Baldwin at the time didn't know why LaRue handled a weapon because he wasn't in security work. The biography of LaRue is very interesting. Goldwater, he worked for Goldwater. In 1963 to 1968, 1964, he worked for Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater doesn't know how LaRue met John Mitchell. One is from Mississippi, the other is from a lawyer for Rockefeller in New York. And this is that clandestine connection, again, of how these people meet, that he takes over in the White House for Mitchell, his right-hand man, and very powerful man in Washington. But
so how
back
would
to
you...
the Wallace thing, his job in the South was to take care of the Southern votes. The Washington Post said LaRue helped woo Wallace votes to Nixon in 68 to keep the Southern strategy going. He meddled in campaigns of other people to make them lose. He had important connections with Eastland, who protected the Justice Department from going into the ITT case. And LaRue's Southern strategy being a Mississippi man, he worked hard to get the Southern votes. He worked with Kleinitz, Mitchell, and they kept the Southern votes for Richard Nixon and all the time kept the North pacified. That was the role that he had, to not let the North know how much they sympathized with the Wallace votes. He was working hard to get the Wallace votes to Nixon and take them away. This is when Wallace was still alive. Now, there was another article this week on in LA Free Press of the American Nazi Party claiming the Republicans paid them, this is John Mitchell again, meeting with Jeb Magruder of the White House, to take their votes away from the Wallace Party, the American Independent Party. They paid the American Nazi Party to, and worked with them and met at a hotel with them, that John Mitchell did with Jeb Magruder in November of 1971 at the Hilton Hotel. They met with the American Independent Party to take the votes away from Wallace. So, you know,
the Nazis
American Nazi Party
met with the American Independent Party.
No, the Nazi Party met with Jeb Magruder and John Mitchell to tell them not to line up in the voter registration with the American Independent Party. They should be Republicans.
John Mitchell?
Yes, John Mitchell with the American Nazi Party.
Why would the American Nazi Party is not that strong in America that would justify having the Attorney General of the United States meet with them?
Well, the article that I have here is written by Alan Zack, and Mary Beth says that they targeted for subversion against the right-wing American Independent Party, that the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon didn't only go against the Democrats, that they met at the Hotel Hilton in November 71, and their outline was to get the American Independent Party off the California ballot and get them all registered Republican Party. They kept saying, we have to get California because Nixon's sensitive about California. It said the committee to re-elect the president was concerned about Nixon's chances in California. If Wallace were not on the ballot, 4 out of 5 of his supporters would go Nixon. Now that was planned a year ago, that they were what to do with Wallace. It makes you wonder. It really does when you see how the poll came in and what happened to Wallace. And the way Bremer was treated and the amount of money Arthur Bremer had, you see, and his mobility and airplane tickets and his sentences being reduced. Bremer had contacts, and I was hoping always that the election would be put off some way until we'd find out if Wallace was shot in order for Richard Nixon to have those votes. But the election's over, and I don't even know how much can be done to talk about dialogue conspiracy after the election. I wondered about it, Phil, if there's much point in talking about it. You're talking about an administration that's in power now for the rest of time, and to say...
I mean, the rest of time.
Well, I don't
for
think...
4 years.
No, and then there's Mr. Agnew that's going to come along. There's the way they took over the Democratic Party and the media. There's no way that they can be uprooted, I don't think, now.
Do you think that, looking ahead to 76, that Ted Kennedy will overcome Chappaquiddick?
No. No, he's chasing around with somebody already. They're getting the goods on him. He's got another girlfriend, and, you know, I don't think he wants to be president. He's going around.
Don't just drop that one.
What?
What do you mean he's going around with he's got another girlfriend?
Haley of Columbia Broadcasting, his daughter, I forget her name, they have allegedly been meeting, and it's been written up in the newspapers and the gossip columns, and he's got this girlfriend that he's been seeing or traveling with or associated with, and certainly indiscreet in the fact that it's written up in many places, and in the Chronicle and Women's, where the New York, the Daily, and I see a lot of the newspaper articles mentioning the company of this particular person, and I don't think he wants to be president after what happened to his 2 brothers, and the older brother died before he had a chance to become president. The father wanted him to be. So I think Ted, his behavior will be such that he'll continue acting the way he did before. I just don't think he's presidential material.
Yet the talk around, even before this election was over, was, we'll wait till 76, it'll be Kennedy-Agnew.
Well, that's a lot of talk. In order to be presidential material, you have to act like, you have to behave yourself. To see the things that he does, you'd never get Agnew or Richard Nixon on. They just don't wander around that way. And so if you want to come down on them, it would be easy to defeat him at any time just based on his past record. I don't see how he could. The Democrats may want him, but there'd be such a smear campaign. And I don't know that he's presidential material. This is just a
Who
build-up.
is? Do you see anyone emerging as a viable challenger to Agnew?
Oh, you mean
Or
the
are we fated to, from the Democratic standpoint, fated to 8 more years, not just 4 more years of Republican administration?
Well, my definition of what is presidential timber is different than a lot of people's. There's a certain honesty or concern about life, the life of individuals, public figures, and students being killed, civil rights leaders being killed, and we're going on now to the subject of a member of our local community being killed. And if the politicians don't speak up and care about that, if they just speak in platitudes like the war or the economy, then I just don't think it matters who's there because they're just throwing around a lot of words. I see very few people, I can't think of who has the courage. The people that have the courage get killed. You know, the ones that speak up about certain situations get killed. In fact, most of the program today, I didn't even want to talk about elections. I wanted to talk about a somber subject about death because in our own local community, a member of our local community was killed, shot last week and died on Sunday of this last week, and that was Brady Avery. And I thought I'd talk about his death and what it means in terms of what he was trying to do, and for the remaining of the show, just read off the other people that were killed like him, whose deaths are very suspicious, that are unsolved, and go into the possibility of, are these things conspiracies? How do you separate a simple family quarrel from a planned conspiracy? How do you know where one begins and the other ends, and when does the information come in? Is everything a conspiracy? Is every death a conspiracy? Or can a family, a particular family, just have a fight and one member shoot the other, such as in the family of Brady? But Brady was a 49-year-old businessman in Seaside. Did you have him on the show? Did you know him, Phil?
I had interviewed him several times.
Yeah.
Had met him at the People's Parts House in Seaside.
Well, Brady had a car repair shop in Sand City, which was predominantly all white, and he and his partner are black, and they were hassled, and they wanted to remove the blacks from this particular location. This is what Brady thought was happening. And he had a recall suit out in Sand City because his livelihood was stopped. And he went to court, and he used the court and the legal system. He worked within the system. He became more radical as each day went on, but he tried to work within the system to see if you can't get a break or get a fair shake. Brady's political background at the time of his death, he was a member of the Third World Movement, Black Liberation Movement, a candidate for peace and freedom for assemblyman. He ran against Bob Wood, and he ran for the Seaside City Council. And Brady had a suit, and Francis Heisler, attorney in town, took the suit to the court that went up to San Jose, the higher court, and he won a $42,000 suit in his favor because of the harassment and the moving of his business out of the Seaside location and the Sand City location. And in the suit, he named Philip Calabrese, the mayor of Sand City, and other members of the city council and the chief of police in Sand City. And Brady stood up for what he believed was right. He was hassled by the police and chased around and given a really hard time in Sand City and Seaside, but he took this thing to the court and was awarded the $42,000, which really seemed too good to be true.
Yeah, no, that's what Brady claimed, and that's what the jury agreed with.
Yeah, on November, it was a jury, on November 8th, 1971, he, in front of U.S. District Judge Peckham, he won $42,000. Now, instead of being paid this amount of money, the judge who said that he had won the suit stated 2 weeks before his death, this is 2 weeks ago, that they'd have a retrial on the suit. And what does that mean? That means that Brady has to give up his work and go up to San Jose, and the lawyer has to give his time, and it costs thousands of dollars to retry a thing which 2 years ago he won and never received the money. It's expensive to go back and forth. And 2 weeks before he was killed, they told him, get a settlement for $3,000 or have a retrial. Where for a poor man working, making a day-to-day expense, it's very difficult to retrial. It's difficult to go to court in the first place, but to go up there, it's almost impossible. So Brady, he had to make that decision, and here was $42,000 sitting out there, and now Brady is killed. And will there be a retrial? Will his family get that money? What happens to him? Well, was Brady murdered because certain elements in Seaside thought that he was a thorn in their side? Was he controversial? What was he doing? The military men in Fort Ord around the area, the black radical, he was the most outspoken, the only actually black radical in the Seaside area. And it's significant to talk about him because the only one who was standing up for certain privileges that should be his as an American citizen, and he was shot in the back. And the circumstances of his being shot were that he had a fight with his son-in-law. And the son-in-law went in the other room and got out a 20-gauge shotgun and shot him in the back and just blew his intestines out the front and blew off his arm. Shot him twice in the arm and in the back with this terrible weapon.
This is coming from who?
Well,
since the thing is going to go to trial, I'm going to be careful what we say.
This is the actual fact. He had this shotgun, and Brady was shot twice. And he was
that
in
much has been
4 days.
reported by the news media.
Yeah,
so.
and then he died. And the important thing about this case is that Brady, I don't want to do anything that will affect the trial, but Brady was a controversial person in his community because he was speaking up for certain things that he believed were his right to earn a living in that particular community, to not be chased around by the police. He took the thing to court, and very conveniently, by his being dead, he probably, unless they can raise a lot of money, won't get back to have a retrial. With him deceased, his partner still alive. If people want to send contributions to KLRB towards that trial, there was an article in the Herald this week that Francis Heisler will take the trial. And at Brady's funeral this week, it was suggested that they fight for this trial. That this is a racist, one-sided world where when you win a trial, you can't even win it. You lose in death. And if money is raised, I believe Francis Heisler will proceed to retry that case for the heirs of Brady Avery. And I think he won that through a jury trial, a fair trial, and just 2 weeks before he was killed, they said, go back for retrial. And something is really unfair about that, and I think about it because the last time I saw Brady, he had listened to some shows on KLRB, and he was getting a little more interested in Dialogue Conspiracy because he felt that he wasn't going to live very long, and this was just about 2 months ago. And he and Shelley were at my home, and we were talking, and he wanted to know the pattern of conspiracies. Who are all these people? It's always one side that's being killed, and I'm going to bring in, I brought in some of the people to mention.
Okay, let's get to those in a minute after we take time out to break the station and take a short break. You're listening to Dialogue Conspiracy on 24-hour KLRB FM, Carmel. Back with part 2 of Dialogue Conspiracy, which is in its 85th week. I don't know, I've lost track, but it's somewhere in the mid-80s now. A weekly program, 1 hour in length, and it deals with current events as they relate to past events and how they might influence future events. Politics, and politics touches every part of everybody's life, so it really touches life. Conspiracy, Dialogue Conspiracy, because Mae is of the opinion that there are a few of them working that are influencing our lives, maybe even a little more than democratic actions. I hope I haven't misled
No.
what the pattern of the show is. May, you were saying you were going to list other
Oh,
people.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, Brady was talking about conspiracies and what is the pattern of these people that are getting ripped off and who's being ripped off and how many and what is the connecting link, because he was beginning to feel less secure, maybe because of his victory in the courts, up there, that he wasn't going to be around long. There was something in the air, the atmosphere, that he was curious about the kind of conspiracies I was talking about. And
Did he actually say he was going to be murdered? Or?
oh, he was shot at just a couple months ago. Yeah. He and Shelley were shot at just not long ago before this happened. And he's hassled all the time. Yeah, it isn't very comfortable to fight the system and survive. Even Senator Proxmire got death threats recently about the Lockheed loans if they went into that, that his life was threatened. But there was an excellent article, 2 articles that pertain to the war coming home, and this has to do with people like Brady and others who are beginning to speak up about the injustices in our society. They were in Computer and Automation, February 1972, on the CIA, and the articles, one is by Fred Bramfman and Steve Cohn, and they talk about the CIA operations that are spreading out all over the world, from Bolivia, Congo, Iran to Vietnam, that are coming home now, and that the U.S. government is going to be the recipient of this secret army, their recruits and their supplies. And they refer to a book by Marchetti, who worked with the CIA for many, many years and has given up that job, walked in one day and said, "Richard Helms, I can't do it anymore." Marchetti talked about assassins and killers in every corner of the globe. And in his book, The Rope Dancer, he talks about the agency. And he says, and this CIA agency is coming home, and it's increasing power here at home. When he sits with the men and hears them talk, he realizes that they're going to turn on the Americans and do what they did in Asia. And another article in the same issue of Computer and Automation, February 72, on the Central Intelligence Agency, $6 billion a year, goes into an interview that Victor Marchetti, had with the UPI in October of 1971, where he said the agency is perceived to be amoral, and it's filled with military influence, waste, and duplicity. But he says right now they're coming home to the domestic operations, the student groups, the black movements, and the like. And he goes on to say how dangerous it is to have them moving home onto America, that as the war winds down and they need new enemies and people are speaking up about oppression or indignities in this country, that the CIA will move on us. And he goes on, Marchetti said, that it is a private tool of the White House. Now we see the team that the Watergate has been exposing, Mr. Segretti, who's at Fort Ord, who's really Army intelligence, and moves right from Fort Ord to the White House and flies east and back and forth on our west coast of the Fort Ord area, just blocks from where Brady Avery worked. You have a whole nest of Central Intelligence agencies watching radicals. I'm just posing the question, how safe is someone like Brady in a community there where he's talking about oppressions? And Marchetti says the nature of intelligence is you do things because they have to be done, whether it's right or wrong. And if you murder, he goes on, then you murder. And the big concern was that fake airlines would bring in weapons that they have a stockpile all over, and they'd use them against the Americans themselves. And Marchetti's big concern was that the war is coming into America, and he couldn't stand that against the black radicals. So,
are you saying that the CIA has a philosophy that whatever it takes should be done in order to accomplish whatever goal they have?
Yes.
Outside of law?
Oh, yes.
Outside of the Constitution?
Well, that's common knowledge. They don't have any boundary of law. They're completely patriotic in terms of their definition of patriotism. No, they have carte blanche to murder anybody.
Controlled by anyone in particular?
Well, they get their instructions, I guess, from the National Security Council, but the point is that they are after the black radicals, and Brady Avery was a black radical. And you have to watch. Once again, he's just one more person to be felled by a weapon, to die from a particular group that's speaking up.
Who's giving the orders?
Well, I'm sure that a lot of people who do not want blacks to object to being kicked out of a area, where they want an all-white group in Sand City, they're going to get it. And whoever would want to get rid of a person speaking of the injustices or winning a case in court, they could arrange to have that taken care of. You see, this is a bad precedent for him to win in court, because as soon as other people begin to learn to study the law books, that was said at Brady's funeral very eloquently, when you begin to study your law books and take your destiny in your own hands, then the balance of power begins tilting back to the other side. And
Are you suggesting that the CIA was involved in Brady's death?
As long as the time allows now, I'm going to read off a few other deaths that have occurred, and I'm suggesting that an awful lot is happening. Maybe you don't realize how many people who think like Brady are being felled down, and something is happening, because they're just, these are just recent articles I pulled out because I was coming in today and wanted to talk about this.
Okay, why don't
Here's
you
an
get into
article on the death of Raymond Yellow Thunder. This was March 6th in 1972, March 9th, an Indian in Nebraska, part of the American Indian movement, and the leaders met, and the Indians claimed that he was tortured and castrated and attacked by the Legion, and his death
The
became
Legion?
by the Legion Hall. I'm sorry, the Legion Hall. Smith, he was taken there. This Indian leader was active. Yellow Thunder's body was taken and found later, and it was taken to the American Legion Hall, where he was made to dance, and they stripped him down, castrated him, and so forth. And he was active in Indian organizations. This was in March 9th, 1972. Alcatraz militant in October of this year was 21st. We didn't have time to talk about that. We were busy on the Watergate. Richard Oakes. He was attacked once before and had a plate in his head, and at the time I wanted to go up to see him, but he was too sick, and then he went away for a while. Richard Oakes was the leader of the Indian invasion of Alcatraz, and he was killed in what they called an altercation on a road. He was shot, and only weeks before he was busy actively organizing in Indian fairs again. He was active in Indian fairs. He was critically injured in January 71, and this time he was killed for good. A professor, September the 21st, 1972, Wolfgang Friedman, a man who came from Nazi Germany, who was a judge there, who was against the stormtroopers. He was killed in New York City. He was an author. He worked on legal foreign investments, and he was strongly anti-Nazi. He worked in international law, and he was just recently killed. He was stabbed and in New York City and slain. No more found on that. In Boston, Joseph Strickland, a teacher at Harvard University, assistant dean at Harvard University, nominated for Pulitzer Prize. This was in October of this year, of 1924. From the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. He was stabbed in evidently no motive. Somebody seemed to know him, had been in his place. He was found dead in a bathtub. He was important politically. He wasn't just a Harvard professor. He covered the Detroit riots and wrote books about them in 1967 and he got an award for exposing living conditions among migrant workers in Detroit. And this gentleman also was instrumental in finding persons involved in that famous Algiers motel murder that John Hershey wrote about during the Detroit riots. Detectives were questioning a number of acquaintances of the dead man because he was instrumental in locating a key witness in the killing of 3 people at the Algiers motel. That professor from Harvard was murdered. Here's a story at the time of Angela Davis's trial. This is August of this year, up at Santa Clara County. A man said he was offered $1,000 to stage a jailbreak so that the jury would be influenced. And another man named Mr. Zitzer, Jacob Zitzer, was in the infirmary on sick call. He went out. He was shot on the street by the same people that wanted to influence a jury for Angela Davis. I'm talking about cold-blooded murders for political effect. Here's the story of 2 hired assassins that killed James Carr at the same time the Angela Davis trial was going on. James Carr was a friend of George Jackson's. He was out of jail. He was working at Santa Cruz at University teaching about the inequalities of the prison system, helping people to better themselves. An intelligent black person working in the system to teach and get himself ahead. He was killed just at the time of the Angela Davis trial. And his brother-in-law, Tackwood, that we talk about all the time, Louis Tackwood, had said that there was a plan down the LAPD to kill James Carr. His brother-in-law was killed, but he was killed to affect Angela's jury. Here's another, this was at the time Martin Luther King's brother was found floating at a swimming pool late at night. Nobody saw him, no evidence of foul play. And the Reverend A.D. Williams King, the only brother of the slain civil rights leader. Fred Jones this year in May, regional educational chairman of NAACP, was found stabbed to death in his luxury apartment in New York. Detectives discounted burglary as a motive for the slaying. Fred Jones, regional educational chairman of the NAACP. The story to kill Chavez this year, that came out. This was in January of this year. This was from the Treasury Department, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. The people that we're learning about the Watergate, these men, Howard Hunt, 22 years with the CIA from the Treasury Department. Segretti told a friend of his, Shipley, another lawyer from Tennessee, I'm paid by the Treasury Department. He's in an espionage, unlimited funds. And here was a plot to kill Chavez that was blown only because they were supposed to destroy Union records before they killed Chavez. And at the time, I tried to call the people that work with Cesar Chavez because, see, Phil, what they do, they destroy the evidence to make it look like a robbery, but the intent is to kill Chavez. They said, you kill Chavez, this was the plan, but first you have to destroy the records up at Delano. They didn't want the records, but they destroyed them to make the motive look like it was a Union thing. But the cold-blooded plan was to kill Chavez. See, the motive always looks different, but the burning of the records was only to scramble the motive, you see. Here was a murder of a Mrs. Pratt, slain Black Panther Sandra Pratt in L.A., November, this is 71. She was found shot to death in Linwood, and a week later she was identified as a defendant in a trial of the 13 Black Panthers. Nearly everyone connected with the Panthers considers Sandra to have been murdered by police agents. A statement drawn by the Revolutionary People's Communication Network said that her murder was part of a continual plot to destroy the revolutionary black leadership in America. This attempt, the old divide and conquer tactic, is designed to create paranoia and set blacks to killing one another, to make the job of eliminating blacks and many other revolutionary people easier. See, this is the pattern with the James Carr thing. They tried to suggest Huey Newton was in on it. Here you have Brady Avery with a black son-in-law shooting him. I'm thinking when I talk about our own local community and the political position Brady had, and I look at maybe 100 or 200 other deaths that are in my filing cabinet, and I keep lists. I separate, in my filing system, not every death that happens, but certain patterns that are taking place, like musicians, writers, colleges, judges. I classify them under different topics, like labor leaders, like Reuter and Yablonsky, or foreign leaders, or Panthers, or blacks that aren't Panthers, or Chicanos, and the mafia murders, and the students, and the family massacres. And there's a pattern, see, running through this that isn't any different than what Brady was doing at the time that he was shot. Here's a story about Kent State, where a man began to investigate Kent State. And the more he got into it, he was the father of one of the people killed. And the more he got into it, the more worse it was. And that's the way I started with the John Kennedy thing. The more I got into it, the worse he was. And he said he was determined to do something about this. So in June, he published a finding of 227-page report. And it charged that a half a dozen or so guardsmen agreed minutes before the shooting that a prearranged signal they would turn and fire upon students who they believed to be the leaders of the campus unrest. And
That's kind of a heavy charge.
oh yes, there was much evidence. In fact, there was replaying the shooting. Somebody had a cassette or recorder. They heard one shot go off as they believed a signal, and then the others. But John Mitchell, as the Attorney General, said the case is closed. The family wanted to open up. They said the case is closed. The two student leaders that they wanted, Sandra Shore and William Schroeder, were killed, and 9 others were wounded. And the charge is that these targets were chosen by those guards. He wrote this up in a document. I got this article from Life magazine. He wanted to show that the system works, he said, by doing his research and giving them evidence, which is what I've tried to do in my work. And the system works with a shot in the back. It doesn't, or in the head. It doesn't work that way. And as soon as people, I don't know how many more murders will keep going along this line before somebody sits down finally and says, no, this isn't a coincidental script. Here's another one of a left-wing Italian publisher found dead after dynamite blast. This was just recently in March of this year.
Where'd that take place?
In Milan, Italy, a man found dead after a dynamite blast at the foot of a power line. A leftist publisher. In Baton Rouge, there was a question where 2 deputy sheriffs and 2 young black demonstrators were killed in Louisiana. And the governor calls it useless and senseless. But always the leaders, the black leaders, are killed. Here's another article of April this year of Adam Clayton Powell by Roy Wilkins, who claimed that he had more to worry. It said the Negro American who caused more white Americans more worry than any other single black individual is dead. Adam Clayton Powell. He had a brilliant career as a committee chairman and helped speed the reenactment of social legislation, including Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Well, Powell was put down as a drunk, a woman chaser. He was belittled. He was collecting evidence on the killing of Martin Luther King and the 2 Kennedys. And he had guards around him all the time because he thought his life was in danger. And he died. Suddenly he was flown over here with a cancer, and then there was another kidney thing. There were several discrepancies in the illness, and Adam Clayton Powell died this year, and he was a threat. He wasn't a radical in a clear-cut definition, but he was a threat to the American system. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, Rito Canales and Antonio Cordova of the Black Berets. We're going to discuss the prison situation in New Mexico. And one of them was charging the warden with assault and intent to kill. Antonio, who was beaten by the police in early June, had taken photographs of the cops at a particular beating. But they went to have a conference and discuss the prison problems. They never made it on television. The 2 men, both members of the Chicano community organizers that ran a free breakfast program, community clinic, and newspaper education classes, were shot to death by city police early Saturday morning, January 29th of this year. 12 hours after the murders, 30 cops raided the Albuquerque office of the Black Berets. It was ransacked. The cops said that they were cleared for justifiable homicide. Another one, George Randolph Farenthold. This is the stepson of millionaire stepson of the woman who ran for governor, Frances Farenthold from Texas, who was doing so well this year. In June 7th of this year, her son's neck was chained to a concrete block, gangland fashion, and he was bound by the neck and sent out to Corpus Christi Bay and sunk in the bay. The chain around his neck was tied to a 25-foot concrete block. This boy was not a radical. He had a fortune of $20 million, supposedly, estate. But his mother, was very active fighting the political system in Texas, working with the Chicanos, the Mexican Americans, and almost had a chance to make a dent into that system. She's been working very hard, Sissy Farenthold, in Texas. That's her son. Here's another one in the Jackson, Biloxi, Mississippi, in the dormitory where 2 blacks were killed, and the state shot them, and everyone was relieved of all charges. They were sued, and they were let go. Here's another one, an autopsy this is the Jimmy Carr one, riddled with 40 open wounds, 40 pellets of bullets. That was up in San Jose. Mexico City, the shattered body of General Vázquez Rojas was delivered to Mexico City. He was killed either in a high-speed auto crash or an army ambush, depending upon the sources. He was active in working for improvement of the area of the Mexican people in the guerrilla activity. He was shot, and that was in February of this year. A Guatemalan politician was assassinated, active in the National Liberation Movement. This was June of this year. I have many, these are current. Most of these are just from this year. The kind of things that are taking place. People that are active in political movements are getting shot in the back. Here's another one in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a civil rights group. This was a different group. Roy Calgaios, 19-year-old of Santa Fe, was shot in the back of his head. He was active in the civil rights movement down in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they said, grand jury said justifiable homicide. There was another one in El Paso, Texas. A slaying last Wednesday of a Colorado Mexican-American on the way to El Paso to attend the first National Convention of La Raza. And the Lieutenant Governor Robert Mondragon of New Mexico wanted a federal investigation of the slaying of Robert Falcon, shot to death, active in La Raza.
You have a pile. You just keep going.
Well, I could go for 2 or 3 or 4 hours. You see, there is a pattern of slaying people active in civil rights movements. Here's a man, a hijacker, who supposedly protested the Nixon. He's from Vietnam. He was killed. He was supposed to be hijacking a plane. The plane wasn't hurt. He didn't take anything. He was conveniently killed. He had written to President Nixon to say that he was going to help the Vietnamese struggle for national liberation because the war was wrong. He's a South Vietnamese student, and he was killed. The list goes on. Here's Chile charges the CIA with killing the ex-vice president. A seditious plot was financed. They said this was in March of 1971, financed by the CIA. The techniques of the assassination is the operation of a group led by the CIA, that General Rene Schneider, Chile's army chief. They claim that the slaying of I can't pronounce it. I can't pronounce his name.
You got me.
Okay.
Chile
ZUJOBIC were carried out by a group of habitual delinquents in the service of the right wing and the CIA. Many countries overseas are accusing the CIA. Marchetti said they would come into the Philippines and take over. The Philippines has been overthrown since.
Okay, well, you've shown, we just have a couple of minutes left, you've shown through those articles a lot of people are getting murdered.
A lot of
and a lot of people who are involved in controversial political matters.
A wide range of them.
Do you want to take it one step beyond that and explain what the point of all that is?
Well, the point is that when a member of our own local community, who's the only black radical in the local community, who's had the ability to speak up, run for public office, make himself known for what he believes in, is shot in the back by a shotgun, you have to watch the trial that comes up. You have to watch the atmosphere of the community. You have to ask yourself, is he one more of this long list of political assassinations? Is it a family quarrel, or is it a political thing? And we won't know for many, many years maybe how things evolve in this particular case. But I think it's important to know who's being ripped off and how they're being ripped off. And the warning signs we get from men like Victor Marchetti inside the agency that says they're coming home to do this to our community, then we have to look carefully at our own community and not talk just about Dallas or Memphis or Los Angeles where Kennedys or King were killed. We have to look at our local community and keep our eyes open and be objective and not emotional and evaluate how far the war is coming home, if it is coming home to our own community. Will we recognize it when it comes? Just be objective and not emotional, but be open to the fact that anything is possible as we move into the next period of bringing the war home.
Well, that's Dialogue Conspiracy for today. We invite anybody who has any questions or comments on programs. Your comments are always welcome. Send them to the address that we'll mention in a moment.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy, a public affairs presentation of KLRB News. If you have questions that you want answered on future programs, or any comments, write Dialogue Conspiracy, KLRB, Box 3904, Carmel, California 93921. I'm Phil Kogan.